So Balto is the one who became famous after the event, but in the meantime, over the last several decades, it was found out that Togo was really um, one of the heroes too. So I'm assuming you all know a little bit about sled dogs. Have any of you gone sledding, or do you mush, any of you? Wonderful. Well, you know, here in Maine, we have several opportunities. There are 3 or 4 companies that offer mushing vacations. And then, of course, we have the Can-Am race that I think is coming up fairly soon. I believe it's early March. And during the course of researching this talk, I didn't realize that there are sled races all across our country. 2 very well-known ones actually take place in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. So our state has a great heritage for sled racing. So you know probably that sled dogs have been used in polar explorations, north and south. They're still used today in many of the northern regions, but they were outlawed in Antarctica a couple of decades ago for environmental reasons. But sled dogs were really instrumental in getting both of the polar regions explored, mapped, documented, and so forth. Today, in the northern territories in Canada, as well as in Greenland, Finland, northern parts of Norway and Sweden, northern parts of Russia, dogs are still used for transportation when modern things like snowmobiles aren't practical. They're also still sometimes used for mail deliveries and other things. So they're still carrying out a tradition that they've really been doing for about 9,000 years. And I didn't know that. So these dogs obviously were originally trained specifically to pull some kind of conveyance that we now think of as a sled. Some of the early primitive sleds looked more like toboggans than sleds, and it depended on their use. This, I don't know how big this shows up on the screen here, but this is an early image done in 1819 after a British Navy trip to West Greenland. And the artist was a member of, this is Captain John Ross, who was a famous explorer.
Sorry, Pat, if you're not in front of the microphone, Zoom can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Captain John Ross was a famous polar region explorer in the late 18th century. And this is one of the first, if not the first, Western portrayals of sled dogs. And you can see, which I'm going to talk about harnessing in a bit, but here are 2 little sled dog teams. And you can notice the one in the background has what we call a fan hitch. So we'll get to hitching and harnessing in a minute. No, it's okay. I can see it here. I just wasn't sure I could do pointing. So several years ago, an archaeological expedition in northeastern Siberia found the remains of dogs. After doing a lot of research, it was determined that those dog remains were really the progenitors of what we now think of as sled dogs. And it was surmised because of other things found near the bone remains, such as pieces of harnessing, ropes, laces, and so forth, that these dogs had been used for some kind of transportation. And the Chukchi people, who were in northeastern Siberia, here on the Chukchi Sea, were the ones who developed this system of using the dogs for transportation. The remains that I mentioned were here on Zhokhov Island, which thousands of years ago was still connected to the mainland. So the Huskies we know today as Siberians have descended from this line, and that the Siberian genome is still relatively pure. So studies have shown, and there are several scientific ones cited here, that these dogs were bred specifically to excel at transportation and hauling, but then they specialized. Larger dogs were bred to go after large sea mammals and game, and the smaller dogs were bred to be ideally stronger and faster for hauling and transport. And these smaller dogs, weighing between the 35 and 55 pounds, have developed something called thermoregulation. And that's why these original breeders, the Inuit and Chukchi people, found that that size was ideal for regulating the dog's temperature to reach an equilibrium between cold and warm, so that even though they're working in extremely frigid conditions much of the year, their bodies can regulate their temperatures so they don't get cold. And they also have something in their legs. All dogs have it, but these dogs probably have it in spades, something called counter-current heat exchangers. So if you see a diagram of a dog's leg, there are blood vessels and arteries flowing up and down. The heat exchangers help the dog maintain an equal temperature in its legs, and that staves off frostbite. So even when these dogs are sleeping outside, which most of them do, they huddle and they will burrow in the snow. They use their tails, which they can wrap around them because their tails are large. So that creates some heat, but also their paws are protected by this heat exchange so they don't get frostbite. It's pretty incredible that these ancient people figured all this out. So harnessing was mastered by those Chukchi and Inuit peoples centuries and centuries ago. But Western explorers didn't really get the hang of it until almost the late 19th century. And the more successful of our polar explorers worked alongside Inuit guides and sometimes Inuit mushers on their exploration trips. And you can see here, next slide here, there are various types of harnessing techniques. Obviously, if you are only traveling with one dog or up to 3 dogs, you don't need such an elaborate system. But the fan hitch, which is here on the bottom, is favored for traveling in open space, tundra or glaciers where there are no obstacles like trees. The gangline hitch, where the dogs are either in single formation here or double, is used when the when the trail is more narrow and circumscribed by trees or other obstacles. And these gangline hitches are what's usually used in the mushing excursions today. But the fan hitching is favored in Greenland and other northern countries. So the Inuit are descendants of the Thule people who came from the Bering Strait and migrated across from the Bering Strait and Bering Sea to what is now Greenland. But they kind of settled all across northern Canada and then into Greenland. This is a 1863 print done in Denmark by an unknown artist, showing various hunting and domestic scenes, but it does show a fan hitch right here. So you can see a relatively small number of dogs, but the hitch is the fan hitch. So as I'm sure you all know, polar exploration really has been going on for many centuries, but it became really popular in the late 19th into the kind of pre-World War II era on both poles. And there were many reasons why people or nations got into polar exploration. Of course, it was patriotism, pride. Some explorers were only interested in the scientific aspects of their trip. Some were well-financed, some self-financed, some lost money and had to work many years after their expeditions in order to pay their crew and other debts, such as building the custom ships that many of them took to the poles. Many tragedies and heroic rescues and amazing stories are connected with almost every voyage that's been documented. And our library here has a very nice collection of, which is what gave me the idea for doing this talk, actually, because Em had a display out a couple of months ago. So the library has some books about the polar explorers, and I think probably a few books about sledding and the techniques of sledding. So I would, those of you who are interested in reading either about the great explorers or about the logistics of doing those trips, please start here at our library. Many, many hundreds of dogs lost their lives or gave their lives in the interests of science. Attitudes about animals, as most of you know, because I'm assuming you're all animal lovers, attitudes toward animals versus humans have changed for the better in the most part. But at the turn of the last century, animals were still considered by many people to be expendable. They were supplies rather than sentient beings. And so many of these trips that started out with huge numbers of dogs, even up to 100 or more, sometimes lost that entire group of dogs through just lack of knowledge, lack of basic medical care, fighting among the dogs, and then some tragedies that occurred when teams would go over a crevasse or other natural impediments that they couldn't help. One very excellent book here in the library is called Alone on the Ice, and it's the story of Sir Douglas Mawson's 1912 to 13 trip to Antarctica. He was a scientist. He wasn't interested in being the first man to discover either of the poles. He was just interested in pure science. And he took a large group of people to Antarctica from Australia. And when they arrived on Antarctica, they divided up into smaller teams to explore different parts of the Antarctic. And Mawson and two gentlemen were one team. And two of the members of that party met very untimely ends. And Mawson had to fight back alone 400 miles on the ice to reach his base camp. He almost missed the rescue boat that had dropped them off in the fall and came back the following spring to pick them up to take them all back to Australia. It's a gripping story on many levels, but it's an excellent narrative about the logistics of traveling with these dog teams. Not only how much the dogs had to haul weight-wise, but the obstacles that they overcame, most of them overcame. It's really gripping and well worth a read. And by the way, I've left handouts for all of you. This includes a list of American and other institutions around the world that have either the archives of the famous explorers or they have plain research and archival collections of photographs, journals, diaries from the various Antarctic and Arctic explorations. So there's lots of places to go, and also this lists the museums in this country that have sled dog exhibits. There are some permanent ones, including the Iditarod Museum in Wasilla, Alaska, but there are many others. So I'd recommend you taking a copy when you leave. So as I mentioned before, sled dogs were prohibited in Antarctica due to environmental concerns, but one of the last research teams that took a team of dogs was a Japanese research expedition in the mid-50s. And this is just it's a typical but incredible story. They took 15 Sakhalin Huskies, and the Sakhalin Huskies, which I'll go into later, were developed also in northeast Siberia, but they're a different body type. Anyway, this Japanese team took 15 of the dogs, and due to a weather event, the human crews had to be evacuated by air. They left the 15 dogs chained to their base camp with some food in the expectation that a rescue team was going to arrive in the next couple of days. That rescue team never made it. So several of the dogs perished. Some of them actually loosened themselves from their chains and disappeared. And 2 were found a year later when another research team got to the base, and they found these 2 dogs, Taro and Jiro. It's phenomenal that they not only escaped from their chains, but they were clever enough to survive for a year by doing their own hunting and so forth. We don't know what happened to the other dogs that had escaped. So Taro and Jiro continued to work and became heroes, and there's several statues and monuments in Japan. This particular one is in the port of Nagoya, but there are several, and those dogs are hugely revered in Japan, and a movie was made about them. If you Google Taro and Jiro, you can read about the movie. So you've probably guessed by now there's several different dog breeds that are used for sledding. The original ones, which were the Chakota and the Siberians, they're the oldest dogs, specifically bred for pulling sleds. There are other northern breeds, including Lykas, and Siberians were imported to Nome during the late 19th into the early 20th century by a Russian man who was prospecting for gold. And he knew that those dogs would be very handy because of the long distances needed to travel, also transporting supplies, food, mail. Mail was a really big thing because many of the people who signed up to go gold prospecting left their families behind. They didn't know how long they'd be in Alaska or Canada, the Yukon area. And so sled mail delivery was a really big deal in addition to supplies. So Alaskan Malamutes originated in northwestern Alaska on Kotzebue Sound, and they are favored because of their strength and their size, more for hauling strength rather than speed. They were used in World War I and II for hauling and messenger work. Whoops, I hit the wrong button, pardon me. Canadian Eskimo, or what they prefer to call Inuit dogs. These are the original, what I call the primeval sled dog. They're genetically related to the Greenland dog, and those 2 dogs, the Greenland and the Canadian Eskimo, are not similar in genome to Siberian Huskies. Somewhere they diverged thousands of years ago. But other breeds specifically created or honed for sled use were Chinooks, which were developed here in New Hampshire in the early 20th century, and they're known as the gentleman's horse carriage. Those of you who are familiar with horse carriage driving, it's not only elegant, but it's very smooth as opposed to regular horseback riding. The Chinooks are compared to horse carriage horses. Eurohounds are even a newer breed, very sleek dogs that were bred in parts of Scandinavia, specifically for racing in this century. And you'll see here, so the Canadian Eskimo, he's stocky, he's sturdy, he has a Spitz-like appearance. Greenland dogs are a little heavier, lower to the ground, but they're related in genome. Those of you familiar with the Nome Serum Run, or the Great Race of Mercy, that took place in 1925 and was the inspiration for the Iditarod Trail. One of the hero mushers was Leonard Seppala, who was a Finnish gentleman who happened to live in Nome. And he had he worked for the copper mine in Nome. And one of his friends knew Roald Amundsen, who of course made several expeditions to the South and North Pole. Amundsen had planned a trip to the North Pole, which was canceled due to World War I. And Amundsen gave his entire team of Huskies that he had planned to use to Sapala for training. So this gentleman, Leonard Sapala, even a decade before the Nome Serum Run, he already had teams of dogs. He was already the leading sled dog trainer in Alaska and very well known. Here's what the Lacution Laika looks like. You can see it's a little bit smaller and stockier than the Canadian Eskimo. These are Sakhalin Huskies, such as Taro and Jiro. They're taller. They have a kind of shepherd-like appearance, and their colorways are more varied. These happen to be dark, but they come in many different colorways. Samoyeds, which some of you may be familiar with, they are short, they're kind of stocky, and they are used, very favored for sled racing. And then the Alaskan Malamute. They all make great pets too. Here's what Chinooks look like. So you can see they're a little bit taller, more angular, and these are the carriage horse ones I was referring to earlier. And here are the Euro hounds. So these were bred from a variety of different types of dogs, including greyhounds, and you can see the resemblance there. Greyhounds, Irish setters, German pointers, and then some husky. So they've got kind of the best of all genes. Those of you who've been around huskies, or if any of you have been to a sled event, you know, or if you've read any books, they love to work. They absolutely love to work. In most pictures you see of sled dog teams, the dogs all have big smiles on their faces. They get very excited when they're about to go up, get harnessed up and go out. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have read The Call of the Wild. I just reread it. It was the thing that kind of got me interested in sled dogs from childhood. But Jack London's descriptions of the sledding mechanics, good and ill, are pretty amazing, spot on. So I don't know if he ever mushed himself, but he certainly knew many mushers. He knew about dog behavior, dog personality, treatment of dogs. So this Call of the Wild is a great book to learn about the mechanics and kind of what I call the psychology of sled dog racing, or sled dog. They weren't racing, they were used for transportation and mail delivery. But it's a great book. So food in the Arctic regions and in the Antarctic, when the dogs were used there, high fat, high protein diet, plentiful food, sea mammals and reindeer in the north. The blubber was the most important part of that diet because they needed as much fat to keep their energy levels up. Today, performance dogs eat a combination of kibble and fresh food, either meat or fish. And in Greenland, these dogs are still kept outdoors, but they're fine. They're fine with it. So here's a section I call the Sled Dog Chronicles. It's my chronicles. And this quote is fabulous. So I recently read a National Geographic article about sled dog use in today's world. And the opening quote was, "Dog sledding exists at the intersection of chaos and skill." It's kind of a perfect way to describe it because, as I mentioned earlier, harnessing was a technique that the Western people, Europeans and North Americans, it took them centuries to learn, to master. And if a dog team is not harnessed properly, they can get tangled in the traces, they can have injuries, they can tip over the sled. There are many, many mishaps that can occur if the harnessing is done incorrectly. So there's the chaos when the harnessing doesn't go well. And skill, these dogs have traveled or been used in whiteout conditions. You know what we've been going through the last couple of weeks. Not very good driving conditions the last couple of storms we've had. These dogs can travel in whiteout conditions, temperatures down to several tens of below degrees, like -50 or more. And their noses still work. They can pick up a trail or they can discern a trail, even if they're the first ones making that trail. They just have phenomenal natural instinct that no human could ever aspire to. And so this is just one of the many reasons why these dogs have really been instrumental in exploring the two polar regions, but why they're also still used today and appreciated. And in fact, there was one, I don't remember if it's the Chukchi people, I think it was those people. They revered these dogs and considered them to be good luck symbols. And so they treated them as they would treat a fellow human. The dogs were part of their tribe, so to speak. We don't know the names of most of these hero dogs. We just know some of their exploits, and we're lucky enough to have some pictures or sketches, and there have been a few movies made about sled dogs, but most of them are just unknown to us by name. I didn't realize that early fur traders in North America, as well as in other parts of the world, used them to haul their pelts, their beaver pelts or otter, as the case may be. And the Métis were a mixture of indigenous peoples who intermarried with European settlers, mostly in Canada, but also in northern parts of our country. And they also revered their dogs, and they dressed them up in ceremonial. This is just not a special occasion. You would think this is a parade or a special event. That's just the way they dressed their dogs. Very colorful blankets. And these little items, I can't remember what they're called, but they're strictly ornamental. They serve no other function but ornament. And this picture was done in the Red River area of northern America and northern Canada, not to be confused with the southern Red River that's in Tennessee and I think parts of Texas and so forth. So in the 20th century, the dogs were used in both world wars for hauling and rescue work. And in World War I, the French used sled dog teams in the Vosges Mountains where vehicles couldn't go and climbing for people was difficult. And 3 of those dogs were awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is their highest honor, generally reserved for humans, but 3 dogs were awarded that medal. In World War II, they were also used for the same functions as well as search and rescue of downed pilots, which of course became more of a problem than it had been in World War I. They were used not only in Europe, but also in Alaska. Have any of you been to the Bowdoin Museum, Perry-Arctic Macmillan Museum, which I have yet to go to because when I moved up here, the museum was still closed. It was closed during COVID, and then they were completely renovating. So you know, or you may know, that both Robert Perry and Donald Macmillan, of whose names the museum carries, they were both naval officers. They were both polar explorers who used sled dogs on all of their expeditions. But they were very different men. I'm not going to talk about them so much. There's plenty of information you can find, but Donald Macmillan was very interested in the Inuit customs and culture, and he later married a photographer. And the 2 of them documented the Inuit cultures, including recording some of their music or their song. And so he fell in love not only with the people, but their dogs and their dog ways. And he learned a lot from them on how to handle dogs, sled dogs. Perry was a different kind of person. I don't think he had the same relationship with his dogs, but he did create a system that later was used by subsequent explorers, and it's referred to as the Perry system. So he learned from the Inuit people how to dress properly in frigid, sub-freezing temperatures. But he also devised a plan. If you're exploring a large territory, you need to make caches of supplies and food stored at various locations along your planned route because it lightened your load carrying, it lightened the dog's load, but it also increased your chances of survival if you got lost or delayed due to weather. So the Perry system was a huge contribution to later explorers. They both made that 1909 trip in which Perry claimed to have discovered the North Pole. Actually, Matthew Henson got there first. He was a few steps ahead of Perry. But that discovery has since been disputed. And you know that there's a magnetic pole and there's a real pole. It's a little beyond my pay grade to understand, but regardless of whether the Perry team reached the North Pole first, they did do an amazing trip. And Henson, God love him, was with Perry on many of his expeditions, and he was a very modest gentleman. Later, Admiral Richard Byrd, who also who explored both poles, post-World War II, the Navy was very concerned about surveillance and protection of certain areas in the world, including the polar regions, which are also in the news nowadays. And he orchestrated something called Operation High Jump, consisted of several naval ships and teams, including sled dogs, to explore parts of the Antarctic. They weren't there to map it as well as to figure out areas to place strategic bases and communication systems. There's a picture of Macmillan on his schooner Bowdoin, which he designed specifically for future Arctic trips. So when Macmillan did his first few trips, he was on other people's boats, and he wanted something that met his specifications. So here he is with his pup friend, unnamed. And here's Perry on the SS Roosevelt, which was a steamship that he used to get him to the North Pole for that famous 1909 trip, 08 to 09. Here he is with some dogs, also unnamed. The Nome Serum Run is part of our exhibit. That, by the way, our sled dogs exhibit at the museum is up through March 16th. We're open on weekends between 12 and 4, and I hope some of you can stop by because it's a really interesting exhibit. Plus, I'd love you to come visit. But you know that there was a diphtheria outbreak in Nome, Alaska, and because of the time of year, the weather, air transport was not feasible, and land transport was not feasible other than sled dogs. The nearest place where the antitoxin serum could be dropped for further distribution was a town called Nenana, which is here. Whoops, I'm sorry. Nenana is here. Nome's here. 674 miles. That's a trip that would ordinarily have taken weeks. Because of the diphtheria outbreak, these teams, 20 teams of mushers, did it in 5.5 days. They had relay teams, rest stops, and so forth. And because of, I mentioned Leonard Seppala earlier, who was from Nome, but also Balto's handler was Gunnar Kasson, another Finn, who also was from Nome. So these two gentlemen, I like to think, had a really vested interest in trying to save their city or their town. It wasn't really a big city. So these teams worked the 5.5 days. The average distance traveled by any of the teams was about 31, 32 miles. But as I mentioned, Seppala and Togo actually did 261 miles. And then Balto and Kasson did the final 55-mile trip, at which the serum was developed and delivered into the hands of the doctors. Just a word about the Iditarod. So Nenana's here. The trip went this way. And the Norton Sound is a very precarious area. And there are several accounts of Sapala, who happened to make that stretch of the trip. He was going not only over what's called ice bridges, which are bridges over an open space, either a crevasse or a stream or an open part of water. Those ice bridges can collapse at any time. He went over several ice bridges and traveled in whiteout conditions. And it's just amazing that the dogs found the way. They could have all fallen right into Norton Sound because they were traveling at times. You can see how close the trail is to the water. It's literally hugging the coastline, which was a big cliff. As I mentioned before, sled dog racing had actually become popular post-gold rush era. So, and many Siberian Huskies that had been imported to Alaska for the gold rush purposes then remained and were bred to create racing dogs. What's called the Alaskan Husky is different from the Siberian Husky, but it was developed from Siberian stock. The Alaskans are a little bit bigger, more massive, and they're bred specifically for speed. As some of you may know, or maybe some of you have been to Poland Spring here in Maine, Sapala, after the Great Gnome Serum Run and all the publicity and celebrity tours that followed it, he moved to Maine. He had befriended a dog breeder named Elizabeth Ricker who lived in Poland Spring, and she had a kennel. And they went into partnership for a few years, specifically to carry on Togo's line, because he commented after the Gnome Serum Run, that dog was the finest dog he had ever run with. So he moved to Poland Spring, and sadly, Togo passed away in 1929, but not before he created a line of sled dogs. Here's a picture of Gunnar Kassin with Balto, and here's Sapala saying goodbye to Togo. After Togo passed away, Sapala moved back to the West Coast. And they both lived very long lives and published a lot of written articles about their great adventure. So mail delivery is one of the traditional functions of sled dog teams. They've been used for centuries. They're still used, as I mentioned. And here in Maine, we had, I'm not familiar with this area, the lakes area. So Fred Fowler was one of several people who answered a call from the U.S. government to create sled dog mail delivery teams. And the one here in Maine was the only one in the eastern part of the United States. And it ran up through the late 30s. And sled dog teams in other parts of the countries operated up until the 1960s. And as I mentioned, they're still used today in some areas. And to honor that tradition of mail carrying, some of the sled races that take place around the country have first day covers that are created specifically for the mushers to take, and then they're stamped and they become collector's items. And there's a race that took place last weekend in Michigan's Upper Peninsula called the UP 200. And there are several other sled races in Michigan. This one's in a place called St. Ignace, which I think is also on the UP. Anyway, here's a first day cover, which I think is sweet. The Maine Historical Society did an exhibit a few years ago called Mail by Mushers. And if you go online to the Maine Historical Society website, you can look up the exhibit. That's where I found this picture of Fred Fowler and his team. To me, the most exciting thing about sled dogs is not only they have a long and incredible history, but they're still used, and they were in the news recently. You may remember shortly after President Trump took office, he announced he wants to buy Greenland. Well, shortly after that announcement, the Danish government announced, and it was all over social media and in the news, that they were going to increase their military presence in Greenland. The Danes have naval ships that operate around Greenland for protection, surveillance, and communications purposes, but they also have sled dog teams. The Serious Dog Patrol is an elite arm of the Danish Navy that was formed in the 1940s and is still in existence today. So the recent news flash I read was that Denmark was going to add 2 more naval ships to its Greenland patrol and 2 more dog patrols. Go for it. So this Serious Dog Patrol, it's kind of like our Navy SEALs. It's open to men and women, but thus far no women have expressed an interest in belonging. The training is incredible. You can read about it on their website. It's like Navy SEAL training. They have to do everything. They're totally self-sufficient. They even have to learn how to sew, because sewing, you have to repair things that break down on the trail. You can't just pick up your cell phone and get a replacement from Amazon. You do it yourself. So right now, well, this has probably changed, but as of the time I started this talk, there were 2 dog teams. No, I'm sorry, there were 12 dog teams in Denmark. Each team has 2 crew, humans, and up to 15 dogs. They range from 12 to 15 dogs per team. They work primarily in the northeastern section of Greenland, which is the most remote and has the most severe coastline. These men sign up for 2-year gigs. They work round the clock. They don't fly home for Christmas. They work for 2 years. And during that 2-year period, they can patrol up to 9,000 miles of coastline. Because as you know, Greenland has lots of inlets and fjords, and that's where the 9,000 miles comes from. It's incredible. So this is the logo, emblem of the Serious Dog Patrol. And to me, this picture encapsulates the joy. So Frederick is one of the Serious Dog Patrol crew, and his unnamed dog is one of his team members, but that picture kind of says it all, the joy that they take in their work. Any of you who are interested in finding out more about the Serious Dog Patrol, but also about a day in the life of a Serious Dog Patrol crew member, you can find it on YouTube. And I don't know if this is big enough for you to copy, but if you can't or find it, I mean, you can Google Serious Dog Patrol YouTube, and I think you won't have any trouble finding it. I haven't watched the whole thing because it runs about an hour and 15 minutes, but it's a great video of dogs at work. So Sirius, you know, is named after this dog star. So that's my presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions, and I hope you all do come to visit the museum. You're welcome.
Hey, anyone have? Oh, hey, Linda, excellent. I'll give you the mic.
Now I have to figure
Yes, I've been to Greenland, and I spent 2 years up there.
Really?
And I've seen these people in action, and it's amazing what they do and how they take care of their animals. It's absolutely beautiful and amazing.
Were you there for a visit, or were you?
No, I was up there to do some, I'm a retired veterinarian. I did work for the government, and I had a chance to go up there and live with those people and learn about the animals and the
Okay.
environment.
Fantastic.
And it's very, very cool, really. They are. 'Cause they're nice people and everything. But the environment is really harsh, and it takes you getting used to when you've been in a warm climate and you get stuck up there for 2 years. But it's really interesting. Everybody should take a look at that video, because those guys love those animals. Really love them.
They do. I mean, they're family. They're, you know, and their team, as you know, when you're working with animals, if you're doing performance work,
Yeah.
you have to be a close team.
You have to be, and they work together as a team every day, side by side, and they baby their animals just like I baby my animals. A grown man kisses and loves his dog like anybody else does, you know. So it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed this presentation.
Oh, well, you're very kind. Thank you. Does
Anybody
anybody else have questions? Don't be bashful.
Thank you,
Thank
dear.
you. Excellent.
I'm just curious about whether it's healthy for them to put on clothing and boots and things since they have a natural system for regulating their temperature.
You mean as in the Meti with those blankets?
Yeah.
Well, those blankets, as you can see, they're more decorative than
Yeah,
functional.
I was thinking of the ones that put booties on.
Yeah, well, I think in this country where our dogs are rather pampered, they don't live outdoors, hopefully. And if you take your dog out in these temperatures we've been having, and especially with the ice and slick road conditions, booties are not a bad idea. In fact, I saw someone walking a dog yesterday down Main Street here, and her dog had boots on. I can't remember what kind of dog it was. It was a large dog, but in general, these performance dogs would not wear booties, although some of the Antarctic stories I've read, and I've read literally hundreds of books by these various explorers as well as journalists who've been to the poles. In some cases, boots are used, but in general, they're not.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming. And I urge any of you who are interested in dog sledding to go to one of these places here in Maine, because I think, as I said, there are 3 or 4 of them. Some of them will do a day trip, like a 2 or 3 hour excursion, just to get you on a sled. Somebody else does the mushing. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention mushing. Where did that term come from? Well, it comes from French marche, which means to walk or to move on. And now I understand from a friend who does mush, she has Samoyeds, but she doesn't mush with her own dogs, that mush is not usually used as the start command now. There are other commands that are used, but that is the traditional term for sled dog racing and sled dog hauling and transportation. Anybody else? So anyway, I started to say some of these facilities here in Maine, they offer like a 2 or 3 hour excursion when you can have a sled dog ride, but somebody else is doing the steering. And then you can also have longer trips where you actually spend a day or more and you camp at the facility and you're out like 8 hours on the trail, basically from sun up to sundown. And I believe 1 or 2 of the places actually you can learn how to mush. So at the end of your trip, you will be doing the driving and the harnessing and the upkeep. So it's well worth, especially for young people. I think it would be a really cool school trip or vacation trip. Anybody else? Well, thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Pat. This is so informative. Thank you.